Democrat representative tries to take on Matt Walsh over the issue of sex change surgeries for minors and immediately regrets it. Welcome to my channel, Outspoken Samantha. If you are new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're returning, welcome back. Thank you so much for the support. On my channel, I like to give my opinion and perspective on things that are happening today, things that I think actually matter to everyday people, especially those of us trying to raise kids in the insanity known as today's society. I do like to talk about current events and politics and pretty much anything else that pops into my brain. Please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share it with others. Also, be sure you are subscribed. Help me to grow this channel and hopefully reach more people that value logic, reason, and sanity. Also, be sure to head on over to Rumble and find me there under Outspoken Samantha in the event that YouTube decides I have violated their community standards and chooses to kick me off their platform forever. That being said, let's get into today's topic. So if you guys follow Matt Walsh, he is on the Daily Wire, and he's one of my favorite people to listen to because I feel like I can relate to his sense of humor. He sounds like a grumpy old man. When I listen to him speak, I think of Walter Matthau from Grumpy Old Men, and he's going to be this 90-year-old man eventually that just yells at the fence and tells people to get off of his lawn. And I mean that as endearingly as possible because he really does crack me up, but the way he speaks, he has no F's to give. He's going to say the things that he believes in, and he's going to call you out if you try to discredit him or make him look stupid, because he has done his research. He knows what he's talking about. And this idea of gender ideology and sex changes for children, also known as gender affirming care, is an issue that he is particularly passionate about, and something that I can relate to as I have children going through the public education system right now, that this is something that he really cares about, and so I appreciate everything that he does on this issue. He does live in the state of Tennessee, and in November of 2022, the Tennessee GOP introduced a bill that would ban sex change surgeries for minors. And like I said, they're also known as gender affirming surgeries, but let's call them what they are. They are child sex changes, and this bill would ban them for anybody under the age of 18, which should not be a controversial issue. It was not an issue until this radical movement took over and tried to normalize this thing and tried to ignore, years and years of study that indicate that children are not developed enough to make adult decisions. That is why we have so many protections in place and boundaries in place, so that the adults that do have life experience and maturity and can make informed decisions for children, guide them toward a place where they can make those decisions as an adult, get them to that point safely. The idea that somehow, children have, their brains have changed and suddenly they are capable of being little adults, is just complete lunacy. Talking about specifically just about this bill, according to the Epoch Times, it says, "Act would prohibit a healthcare provider from performing on a minor or administering to a minor a medical procedure if the performance or administration of the procedure is for the purpose of enabling a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex." The bill would ban healthcare providers from prescribing puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and elective surgeries for minors for the purpose of gender transition. I want to point out that it uses the word purported as if to say this is not something that has been medically confirmed, that anybody with a medical license has diagnosed them with. It's just what they believe in their mind, what they purport themselves to be, what they believe that they are. If you've ever spent, 5 seconds with a child, they can believe that they're anything. They can believe that they're a unicorn or a mermaid. And when you get into your teenage years, you can get into really dangerous ideas that you're fat when you're not, or really unhealthy ideas about your body as your body changes, as your hormones develop, and you're at a really vulnerable time to believe things that are untrue about yourself because you're really trying to figure out who you are and you're comparing yourself to everybody around you. So it's really the time when we need to be most careful with kids' psychology and their development, because they are going through so many changes and we don't want them to make rash decisions. Of course, there were people that testified in favor of and against this bill. One woman named Prisha Mosley shared her story of the trauma and mental health struggles that made her a prime candidate for transgenderism. Due to her trauma, she started to experience suicidal ideation, and in the process of trying to figure that out and to sort that out in her mind, she was led to believe she was transgender and that becoming a male was the answer, while the actual causes of her suicidal ideation went ignored and unaddressed. She said in her statement, "I will agree that lots of trans kids are suicidal and that suicide is a risk, but in my situation, when I said the word gender, all of the other things that cause those suicidal ideations were put to the side and no longer considered. And getting treatment for trauma and preventative care is much harder to get than trans care." First, she said lots of trans kids are suicidal and that that's a risk. She's acknowledging that. But she also said that she was suicidal before she was advised that she was transgender, and that the things that caused her suicidal ideation went completely ignored. So wouldn't it make sense to say that she wasn't suicidal because she was transgender, or because of anything associated with being transgender, or because she was being denied care, or because she was on the receiving end of hate or lack of acceptance from her peers, or any of the other reasons that trans activists pretend to be the cause of suicide for trans kids? Her suicidal thoughts that were already there were covered up and ignored, and then exacerbated because all of the time and energy that she spent in the care of counselors or even teachers, all of that energy was focused on the transition process, and she carried the suicidal feelings with her the entire time. You have a kid that is already dealing with severe mental health issues, with severe thoughts and problems, and then what you're doing is piling on high doses of testosterone, or even just making her unrecognizable to herself in the mirror, and also destroying the hope that she might have that any adult actually cares about the problems that she's facing when they're refusing to acknowledge what it is that she really needs care and compassion for. There are so many stories like this out there, especially as kids become older teens or young adults, and they're looking back on their experience of going through this, transgender phase, or, at the time that they were presented with this idea, and they're acknowledging the fact that they had a comorbidity of some kind, whether it be trauma or depression or anxiety. And even a lot of kids that have autism are prime candidates for this ideology, and they're saying, I had this other thing going on in my life that went completely unaddressed and ignored, and I was told that being transgender was the solution to my problem. It's a reasonable conclusion to come to that the reason you would have so many suicidal trans youth is because they have all of these things that are being ignored, all of these underlying issues, and they're being given a diagnosis that's completely inaccurate and led down a path that they never asked for, that they never would have gone down had the root issue been addressed. During the hearing for this particular bill in Tennessee, Matt Walsh got up to speak. He was at the table. Never spoken in a hearing for a bill of any kind at your state legislature. Generally, how it's set up is there's a big room and everybody sits down and they'll call different witnesses, pro and against at different times, and you go and you sit at a table, and usually they'll have, I've been in hearings where they do it different ways, where all the people at the table are either for, and then the next group they call up are against, or you'll have half the table for and half the table against, and everybody takes turn speaking, and you usually get about 3 minutes. That's usually how it works. So when it was his turn to speak, he, of course, I know there were a lot of different exchanges between himself and the GOP and himself and the Democrats, but this is one of the exchanges that we're going to listen to. It's about 2 minutes and 42 seconds long. I do recommend listening to the whole thing, but I will put timestamps in case you want to skip over it.
I found it. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I found it interesting. One of our people testified today that they had their gender affirming surgery at 16. And I know you in former comments mentioned this on your blog. At about 16, you're an adult who's mature and can make decisions. You're that at 16. I don't care what anybody says. Even going so far as to say, 16 people. When you're 16, you should be married and could be pregnant or should be pregnant. So I'm curious if 16 is an adult in your view. Why does this bill have the minor defined as 18?
Mr. Walsh, recognized. Yeah, that's a hit piece you took from Media Matters, from something when I was a radio host 13, 14 years ago, in my early 20s. It's also not an accurate reflection of what I actually said. I was talking about the fact that people tended to marry young historically, and that's all that was about. How does that relate to this subject?
Just curious of your definition of if you feel like people are adults at 16 should.
Well, people are adults at 18, but actually, your brain is not fully developed until you're 25. So we should be having a conversation about whether we should even be doing these surgeries to people at 18. But certainly before 18, it's absurd. I mean, do you think that a 16-year-old can meaningfully consent to having their body parts removed? Do you? No?
We do not. Yeah, we ask the questions. It's not you. It's
Okay.
Representative Hammer, you are recognized.
I think it's funny that they ended the conversation with, well, we're the ones that ask questions, but at the same time, they had no problem answering the question when Matt Walsh asked them, well, how is this relevant to the conversation, when they were asking him about this blog post that he posted several years ago. But when it comes to him asking the follow-up question, well, do you think that this is a reasonable position to have for 16-year-olds, that suddenly they're like, well, we're the ones asking the questions. It's like, well, you just don't want to answer when it's not something that you can answer, or something that you don't want to verbalize because you know how depraved it sounds when you say it out loud. I understand the thought process in this Democrat representative and in what he was trying to do in discrediting Matt Walsh, as Matt Walsh wrote this article 15 years ago talking about 16-year-olds getting married, and trying to essentially paint him as a hypocrite, saying that, if you believe that a 16-year-old can get married, then why wouldn't you believe a 16-year-old has the capacity to make a decision like, regarding their gender or medical transitioning. But honestly, obviously context matters, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand. And it really goes to show how far you have to stretch. You shouldn't have to rely on articles from 15 years ago from something that's completely irrelevant to make your case if you truly believe that this is a good thing. I want to play just one more clip. I believe this one is less than a minute long, where essentially this representative also tries to get his credentials on how he can speak on this issue. And I think it is really important to watch this, and then I'll talk about why I think it's important afterwards.
Can you give us a summary of your educational background or your healthcare education experience?
Mr. Walsh, you recognized.
My experience in healthcare?
Your educational background. I'm just curious. You've testified as to a lot of your own research. So I'm curious for what purpose you do that and what background you have to qualifies you to speak to that.
Well, my background that qualifies me to speak to this is that I'm a human being with a brain and common sense, and I have a soul. And so, therefore, I think it's a really bad idea to chemically castrate children. That is my experience. Also, I did. Now, it's true. I didn't go to college, but I did go to school long enough to learn how to read, so I can read the data for myself, and that's exactly what I've done.
Representative Clemens, you're
And for what purpose do you conduct your research and use this brain of yours?
Mr. Walsh, you're recognized.
I use it for the purpose of trying to protect children from being castrated and mutilated. That's one of the things I try to do.
You don't use it to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You don't use it to get clicks on your publication?
Well, are you using it right now to try to get clicks with this interaction? No. I really like the
Mr.
idea
Walsh.
of getting of drawing attention to the fact that this is happening to children. I know you seem to find it very amusing. I don't.
I think it's really important to note what happened here, because it is so incredibly just slimy to do this to somebody that is testifying for or against a bill that is not there as an expert. I have gone to several hearings when I lived in Colorado to share my perspective on why I think particular pieces of legislation are good or bad for the state. And as a private citizen, you are not required to have a particular, degree in education or a degree in the subject matter or to be an expert in the field. You can show up and just provide your perspective as to why you think it is good or bad, or whether it be a personal experience or research that you've done or anything like that. So it would be really disgusting if every time that we showed up as private citizens to share our perspective on something, if we were completely discredited because we didn't have a degree or we didn't practice in that field that is being discussed. So it's really absurd that they would do that, because he wasn't there as an expert. He was just there as a citizen of Tennessee. So I just wanted to bring attention to this particular piece of legislation and let people know things are happening at a state level, and that is where our impact matters the most. We can't, unfortunately, there are kids that are going to be subject to this ideology. They're going to feel the impacts of this ideology for years to come, you know, when they do become adults and realize that the people around them, that the adults that were capable of understanding the long-term impacts of the decisions allowed them to make these decisions about their body at such a young age. They are going to have to come to terms with that later on, and it's going to happen whether these leftist activists and whether these trans activists want to admit it or not. But there are things happening, you know, in the places where we can make a difference, and I want people to realize that there is hope, that it's our impact in our communities at a local level that make the biggest difference on a wide scale. If we can, you know, show up and pass pieces of legislation that make a difference in these areas to keep them from harming kids, you know, in one community at a time, suddenly before you know it, you have a big area that's impacted by it, and you see a big group of kids that is saved from it. Let me know your thoughts on this discussion, on this topic, on this bill in the comments. Hit the notification bell so you can be notified every time I post a video. Please be sure you are subscribed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.